Hello and welcome to Talking Conservation.
The podcast all about conservation of old, traditional and historic buildings and sites.
With me, Rich Aylesbury.
And me, Stephen Boniface.
So folks, this particular episode is talking about who Stephen and I are and what the purpose of this podcast is all about. And the best way of starting that is actually I'm going to do a bit of an intro to Stephen. Stephen's going to do an intro to me. Now, I've written some notes on this because Stephen's got a particularly long history in conservation. So I'm going to just read off the notes if that's all right. But I think you'll appreciate me doing this. So I'm really excited to have Stephen on me. And to be honest, if there was a building conservation guru badge to hand out, then there would be a drawer full of them by now for Stephen. He has spent decades in the conservation world. And when I say decades, I'm not kidding. His journey started back in 1978, which means he's seen the industry evolve in more ways than most of us can probably imagine. But before we dive into his long list of achievements, and believe me, it is a list, let's get to the core of who Stephen actually is. He's someone who's not only passionate about the built environment, but has dedicated his career to preserving the history and integrity of our architectural heritage. Stephen first dipped his toes into the world of surveying as a fresh-faced trainee in commercial estate agency and property management, right after leaving school. But what's impressive is he didn't stop there. No, he went on to earn his qualifications through distance learning, whilst working, mind you, and by 1984, he was a fully fledged member of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, RICS, for those that know it. A decade later, in 1995, he achieved fellowship status, an honour that speaks volumes about his dedication and expertise. Now, if this wasn't enough, Stephen quickly realised his passion lay in building conservation, which resulted in him being the first ever cohort to do what was RICS/CEM Building Conservation Diploma. And that was in 1990. And then since becoming an accredited expert in this field, earning the title RICS Certified Historic Building Professional, which is kind of like being knighted in the world of conservation, don't you think? But it's not about titles and qualifications for Stephen. He is hands-on. Over the last 30 years, at least half, and more recently close to 80%, of his work has been directly tied to conserving historical buildings. Whether it's defect analysis, listed building consents, or complex projects like alterations or extensions to historic properties, Stephen's been there and done it, and most likely written a schedule of works for it as well. Speaking of writing, Stephen has been a prolific contributor to industry journals, including Period House magazine, and he's even played the role of agony uncle for Period Property UK. So if you ever have a problem with a creaky Georgian door or a bit of damp in your Victorian terrace, chances are Stephen's advice has been there to save the day. But it's not just all about paperwork and problem solving. Stephen's commitment to the next generation of conservationists is just as impressive. He co-founded the RICS/SPAB Building Conservation Summer School, and when RICS stepped away, he and his team transformed it into a not-for-profit venture that still runs today, passing on decades of knowledge to those hungry to preserve our architectural heritage. It's one of those initiatives that really shows the heart of the man. And we haven't even mentioned his media work yet. So Stephen's done everything from Radio 4 interview to TV appearances in shows like Britain's Horror Homes. Yes, you heard that right, Horror Homes. But when he's not making guest appearances on Channel 5 or producing educational content for his YouTube channel, you can find him speaking at conferences, training the next generation, or, because why not, advising government committees on heritage matters. So to sum it up, Stephen brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to the table, and he's someone who's not only seen how the industry has changed, but has also shaped it through his work. Teaching and influence are some of the things that Stephen's well known for. If you ever wondered how to restore a Grade 1 listed manor house or fix thatched roofs, Stephen is your go-to expert. So Stephen, that's a bit of a potted history on you. Great to have you here. Tell us, where did this passion for conservation first spark, and what has kept you going all these decades?
Well, I suppose what interested me at first was I was always interested in history. And my parents used to take us on long rambles. I don't know if you as a kid were dragged through muddy fields by your parents, but I was. And sometimes we came across these ruins. And I used to love playing on these ruins, pretending I was a Roman soldier or a knight in shiny armour. And I've always had that interest in history. And then when I became a surveyor, thanks to my grandfather, by the way, my grandfather was a carpenter builder. And he said to me when I was leaving school, he said, you know what you need to do? You need to get into construction. He said, everyone always needs a roof over their head at some point, so you'll always have some work if you're in construction. So he encouraged me. I got into surveying. And in the mid 1980s, I came across a thatched building. And I was sent out to do this survey, and I was standing there thinking, oh, good grief, what do I do next? But of course, my fascination in history and my interest in buildings then came together, because I spent the next few days researching about thatch. Back in the day, we didn't have the internet or anything like that. So this was going back into the old library and doing that sort of thing. And so I researched it, and I thought, this is fascinating. So I went on some thatch courses, believe it or not, and that's what triggered it off. And then I discovered other bits and pieces. And so that is how I come at it from a history interest point of view, but also my interest in buildings and my love of buildings. And I just love going into places and thinking, what has happened within these walls over the years? And I remember going to a building and standing in front of a fireplace, and in it was carved some graffiti, including the year 1646. And I was standing there thinking that was carved during the Civil War. And, you think, crumbs, and it's that sort of feeling you get going around historic buildings. And now I suppose what keeps me going is actually getting the next generations along. When I was starting off, there were very few people involved in conservation. And that was a problem. And I struggled to find what I needed to know. And it was quite a lonely path at times. And I don't see why anyone should have that struggle or that loneliness now, in a sense. And so I'm quite keen to pass on what I've learned and help those who want to get into conservation. So that's what it's all about, really. So anyway, enough about me. You don't want to hear any more about me. Let's find out about Rich. So now then, well, you're the other half of this dynamic duo.
Yeah.
Now, you've been knee deep in building restoration, and if you follow him on Instagram, you'll see that he is really knee deep in mud at the moment. But anyway, he's knee deep in building restoration and really walks the talk. So my co-host Rich, his journey into the world of buildings and restoration actually started when he was at university. Now, while most of us were focusing on getting through lectures and figuring out where our next student meal would come from, Rich had other plans. So back in 2000, while he was studying engineering at the University of Birmingham, he decided to borrow some money and buy a student house in Selly Oak. Now, this was a classic 1920s semi, not your average student project. No, not for Rich anyway. So instead of spending his summer lounging around, Rich spent it working with a builder to gut the place and bring it up to date, as they say. Now, I have to tell you, this involved removing lath and plaster, replacing it with plasterboard. What we all know today was probably not the best idea, but we all make mistakes. So I've done it myself, I'll be quite honest here. And so began his journey into really understanding how traditional construction works and how it differs from the quick fixes of modern methods. A lesson learned the hard way, but we've all been there. It didn't stop there, though. The property market at the time was booming, so Rich got stuck in, buying up run-down semis, doing them up over the summer, turning them round into student lets. So by the time he graduated, he wasn't just leaving with a degree, he'd built up a portfolio of properties too. Not a bad side hustle for a mere student. So after university, what did he do? Now, most people would settle down and focus on a career path. No, not Rich. He took a bit of a detour and joined the army, training as a helicopter pilot. Now, for almost 14 years, he served all over the world, from Northern Ireland, Germany, to Iraq and Afghanistan. He even commanded 658 Squadron flying Dauphins for UK counter-terrorism operations. So if anyone's qualified to talk about staying cool under pressure, it's Rich. But while he was off flying helicopters in some of the world's most challenging environments, Rich never lost his passion for buildings. In fact, he kept renovating properties in his spare time, even managing to buy a house remotely at auction whilst on tour in Iraq. And when he wasn't flying, he was elbows deep in renovation projects. Like the time he used his post-deployment leave to renovate a home for his then girlfriend, now his wife, Naomi. So in 2017, Rich left the army and really threw himself into what he calls his forever home, a beautiful Grade 2 listed property in Gloucestershire. It wasn't exactly move-in ready. It was tired, a bit run down, had been altered all the wrong ways over the years and needed some TLC. So Rich spent the next 2.5 years restoring it full-time, doing every bit of the work himself. So he didn't just focus on how to restore it, he wanted to understand why each element needed attention, documenting the entire process on Instagram. And the result? Not just the stunning family home, but an online community of nearly 250,000 people who have been following this journey. Rich's hand-on experience combined with his deep understanding of building physics means he brings something really special to the conversation. He's not just about quick fixes, he's got an inquisitive mind, and he isn't afraid to dig deeper into the latest trends in conservation, always asking whether they actually make sense. So Rich, you've got a pretty unique path into building conservation. So what was it about that first student house that really sparked your passion? And how has that led to you where you are today?
I would suggest it's probably mostly down to really wanting to understand why it was I had this 1920s semi-detached house, which had a little old dear that we'd been living in there for a number of years. Pretty much no work done to it for probably the last 50, 60 years or so living in there. I move in, and was it my grotty student lifestyle where I started getting damp patches and mold forming? And I was thinking, there's something more to this than just my sort of lifestyle, because it wasn't too much of a grotty student. Which then, of course, started working out, okay, well, there's different materials being used, and I started doing a bit of research then. Of course, this is the early days in the 2000s when it was still a case of plasterboard everything, gypsum plaster everything. And that's really what started the kind of understanding. And with each property I ended up doing, I was learning a little bit more about the construction type of that particular property. Yes, in a microcosm of what is in this area of particular CDO, but actually all the buildings are pretty much built at the same period of time. And I could start to understand, okay, well, this is working on this building, but not working on that building. Why is that the case? Okay, and I had to go back to places. And one thing, like any possible tradesman will tell you, and I'm the same, is I hate doing a job twice. I would far rather do a job correctly the first time than have to go back and redo it in the future. So I would rather spend the extra time of doing that's as best as I can do right now and get it right, or hopefully right, to then not have to return to it. And that's pretty much where I suppose it all came from. But that's probably enough about me and you, Stephen. I think what would be interesting for our listeners is, okay, how have we got together and why have we got together? And that's what the purpose of the rest of this podcast is. This particular episode is going to be about. So, Stephen, do you want to talk about how we met? I suppose probably the easiest thing.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's all thanks to a mutual friend of ours, Duncan Phillips. Duncan is a fellow surveyor, and I've known Duncan for a few years now. And in fact, he's one of my co-directors, as it were, of the summer school, the other one being Marianne Sir, and who, in fact, we've lined up for a future interview for this podcast. So that'll be great. And Duncan himself we'll interview sometime. So Duncan is very much into academia, and he's just about to launch his own courses. And in our discussions about academia, the state of conservation within the professional world, and so on and so forth, I said to Duncan that I was thinking of setting up an online community, which I've now done. It's called a Heritage Conservation Community, and that is specifically for conservation professionals. And he said, well, before you do that, you ought to speak to this chap I've recently met and been speaking to, because he might be doing something similar. I said, well, who's he? He said, Rich Aylesbury. I said, who? With all due respect, I wasn't big on Instagram at the time. I didn't know who Rich Aylesbury was. So he said, oh, yes, he's ex-military. Now, that's frightening in itself, because I'm not the most organised person, and I know how military people can be very organised. But anyway, so he said, why don't you speak to Rich? So I said, okay then. So anyway, set up a chat with Rich, and we soon found we had so much in common, but our platforms are very different. So whereas I'm looking at the professional side, Rich is setting up a platform called Expertable. The aim is to put homeowners looking for advice and guidance in contact with professionals, people, consultants, who can really give them the right advice. Now, the reason for that is that Rich himself has found that there's such a mix of information online. Isn't that so, Rich?
No, exactly that. And I think one of the purposes of doing this podcast series is for a number of different reasons. But primarily, it's three key things, I think, for the purpose of this podcast. And it's really to sort of help inform the public, really, to a certain extent, with regards to certain things that we want them to understand. Educate as well, because there is a huge amount of information out there from all sorts of different sources, and actually be really great to then make sure get it as big an audience as possible, and that's really the aim. Another thing is to entertain. I mean, it should be lighthearted, it should be fun, we've got a number of guests that actually some real characters that we've got lined up that should be quite entertaining to listen to. So that's the plan. But it's all going to be to do with building conservation. Now, this is a term that I think many people have different connotations of. So Stephen is now going to give us the textbook, or at least what we're going to interpretation of what do we mean, but Stephen, by building conservation when we are talking conservation on this podcast.
Well, I think let's first of all say that although we use the term building conservation, we're interested not only in the building itself, but in, if we say, heritage generally, because buildings come with gardens, with landscapes, with outbuildings, walls and garden walls and all manner of things. And of course, there's interiors. We've got interiors within buildings. It's not just the physical structure of the building we're interested in. So in that sense, it's a more holistic term than just building. But I was thinking about this definition, and there are a number of international charters and things that have been written over the years. The overarching body nowadays is something called ICOMOS, that maybe we'll explain on another podcast. But there are a number of charters. And a few years ago, another surveyor I know called John Earl wrote a book called Building Conservation Philosophy. It's no longer in print, but it's an excellent book that looks at building conservation philosophy. But in there, he's got the Borough Charter. Now, Borough is Australia. In Australia, and this was adopted in 1981 in Australia as the charter for them. But it's got a definition of conservation that I particularly like. So this is what it says. It says, conservation means all of the processes of looking after a place so as to retain its cultural significance. It includes maintenance and may, according to circumstance, include preservation, restoration, reconstruction and adaptation, and will be commonly a combination of more than one of these. And I think that's a very useful definition, because for me, conservation isn't only about the past. We're not looking backwards. We're looking forwards. We're trying to look after these buildings so that future generations can enjoy them. But what that means is we've got to ensure that they're not only preserved and looked after as they are, but made fit for the future. Because a building without a use is rarely any use to anyone. It needs a use to make it work and to look after it. So for me, that's what building conservation or heritage conservation is all about. Now, in saying that, what really upsets me really is when I go online and see some of the social media stuff. There are Facebook groups, there are YouTube stuff, and it just upsets me to see what some people are saying. So, Rich, what have you found as well?
I mean, I'm probably one of the protagonists of this in terms of on social media with regards to putting out various bits of potential misinformation from a not quite so informed point. And one of the reasons why I hugely enjoy speaking to the likes of yourself and your colleague Stephen is because I can really get from the horse's mouth, so to speak, in terms of actually this is the why. And the key thing for me is understanding the why we're doing all this. And there is so much misinformation online from people that potentially, myself included, are peddling what they've heard elsewhere without the true understanding of either the technical science behind it or the rationale behind certain things. Saying certain things like, for example, gypsum plaster is not vapor permeable. I mean, that's simply not true. But it may not be the right thing for your building in certain circumstances. So it's having a deeper understanding, and one of the reasons, of course, for doing this on the podcast is we can really hope to break down some of that misinformation online and on social media into print, which is essentially unregulated. And there's a desperate need for people to find information, to go to YouTube, to look at videos. But you search term on YouTube for a particular scenario, you've got 10 or 15 different videos all saying different things. Which one do you believe? So it's really getting to the nub of that true understanding of building pathology and building science to actually sort of saying, well, actually, that shouldn't work or that can't work. And it's really one of the reasons why we're going to be doing some of these further interviews with various people on here who are the true experts in these particular fields to then sort of develop that knowledge further. And one of the things we're going to be doing is dispelling some of the myths, of which there are aplenty with regards to conservation. Stephen, I'm sure you've got plenty of examples of myths that you've come across over the years.
Well, yes, yeah. I mean, one of the biggest myths is what is a listed. But I've got a Grade 2 building. It's only the exterior that's listed. It's only the front, or it's only the bits mentioned in the description. So I come across all these myths, ships timbers, and all different things. But one of our future interviews is going to be with James, and he is going to be talking more about myths. So we're going to be dealing with that later. But it's certainly one of the things we want to try and deal with this podcast is to educate people and inform people in a way that these myths we can forget them, we can get rid of them and deal with them. But I'm coming at it from a professional point of view. And what's interesting here is, if you like, I'm looking at it as a so-called professional, and you're looking at it as a homeowner. And we're already starting to talk about some of the technical matters. So, as a homeowner, how interested do you think homeowners might be in the technical side? And is there a need for homeowners to actually understand some of the technical bits and pieces?
It's a really good question. And my belief, as being in exactly in this situation, especially when I bought the house I'm in now sort of 7 or 8 years ago, is that I've got an engineering background. I've got an inquisitive mind. When someone said, you need this particular type of material, you need this plaster, you need that particular scenario over there, I wanted to believe them. I wanted to understand them, because in this world of, unfortunately, where you've got a huge number of trades and various other things that are out to understandably make a profit, but is that truly right for my building? And the only way that you can actually determine that as a homeowner is to understand what it's going to do, what the implications are, and how your building works and how it's built to work and function. Clearly, how we use our buildings these days are very different to when they were built 100, 200, 300 years plus. We don't have open coal fires anymore. We don't wrap up warm in the winter. We expect to be at 22 degrees or 20 degrees throughout all seasons. There are various different ways we've adapted our lifestyles with hot showers, with cooking, and et cetera, et cetera. We're creating very different environments to what the homes used to be run as. Understanding that and understanding the impact it has on our building materials is only really going to help us with how we can then go on to conserve our buildings, but also make sure they're going to be lasting for future generations as well, in a sustainable manner, without necessarily being freezing cold and all the rest of it. But part of the challenge I found is that when I was getting tradespeople in, or when I was asking tradespeople for advice, many of them didn't have the fundamental understanding of how old buildings work. And I always question, why is that? Because they're the professionals in the trade. Why don't they understand how my building works compared to me? And why is a one-size-fits-all type approach? I mean, Stephen, you've probably come across this in the decades that you've been in the environment.
Oh, yeah. It applies widely through the trades and the professions. I mean, the reality is that if you're in a trade, one of the building trades or a profession, you are going to come across modern buildings. And therefore, from an education point of view, it's far easier to stick to teaching about modern buildings. And indeed, in some courses, they sort of are really not interested in anything older. However, when we bear in mind that a significant number of buildings are, shall we call them traditional. Now, by traditional, I mean not built with the materials in the ways we would do in the sort of second half of the 20th century. And that really counts right up to the Second World War, almost the 1940s. And when you look at the numbers, you could be looking at a third of our housing stock are what we could call traditional. And so it is possible for a trade or a professional to have their working career and never come across an older building. But in reality, most of them will at some point come across a traditional building. And the problem is they're not trained in it. It was like me when I first faced that thatch building. There I was, having been taught all about cavity walls, damp-proof courses, tile and slate build, roofs. And here I am standing in front of a medieval timber frame thatch building. And I'm thinking, what on earth do I do now? And I phoned the office and they said, well, there's no one else knows anything about it, so you better get on with it. And I spent the next 2 days, as I said earlier, just reading up on it. And there wasn't that much literature at the time. But that was part of the problem. Now, fortunately, over the past 30 years or so, we've seen a significant increase. When I started, conservation was seen as the sort of thing, old men in their tweed jackets and pipes and bearded, a bit like me now, would do. That sort of brigade, and it wasn't what a normal professional would do. So I was regarded as a bit of an oddity, just the fact that I wanted to get involved in that. But that's changed. That has seriously changed. So since about 2000, actually, the whole way of looking at buildings and understanding it has changed. And actually, it's interesting to see that this has been driven by the owners of these buildings. The professions, the trades themselves are actually very slow to respond. They're pretty useless at responding. And it's actually been driven by the homeowners saying, I'm not satisfied with the advice I've been given because I've read somewhere about XYZ and I'm not satisfied with the advice I'm being given. And that's forced us in the professions and trades to catch up, which has been good. I think it's the right and proper, but that's the problem. And we still face it today. And most courses now do incorporate an element of traditional buildings, but if you're in a professional course, you might have a module on it. If you're in the trades, you might have a day on it, but you're not going to get a lot on it. And so there is still a need to educate within the trades, within the professions. And we've now got apprenticeships coming back in, which is great. But again, we need to look at how we're dealing with it. And we mentioned Duncan Phillips earlier, and he's very keen on pursuing that. And perhaps in a future episode, we'll explore that with Duncan. But I think one of the things that we need to be careful, and I'm the world's worst at this, is when we start talking, we start using jargon and terms, and people might start thinking, what on earth are they talking about? So, Rich, what do you think about technical things and concepts and terms? How do you feel about that?
It's a real challenge, and this is someone that obviously with a military background where acronyms are just we live off acronyms. We love an acronym, but I think one of the things that we will aim to get across in this podcast series is about taking technical detail and simplifying it, not to the point that it takes away the value, but in such a way that regular homeowners like myself can understand it, can grasp a concept, can get some visualization, if you like, in terms of why certain things have to happen. And that's really where my passion is about that translator role, almost, with taking technical jargon or technical information and making it simplified to understand by all things. And that's one of the factors we're trying to plan on getting across in the podcast. We've mentioned about what this podcast is going to do. I think we'll run through now in terms of how we plan to do that, because I think that's going to be interesting for the audience. And so one of the things is taking the technical information and simplifying it. But what are some of the other things that we're planning to achieve through this podcast series, Stephen?
Well, I think whenever I'm talking to professionals about conservation, in fact, generally about what we do, the first thing I say, the most important thing is to understand the building. And so that means understand what it's constructed of, how it's evolved, how it's working, and so on and so forth. The evolution of the building in both technically and historically. And so one of the things I think we could usefully do for our listeners is to help them understand their buildings. Now, for some, that might be, finding out about the history of their house. But for a lot of people, and I'm quite happy to do that because I find that fascinating. But for a lot of people, it also means about understanding some of the technical sides about how it's functioning, how the materials work, which you just alluded to in some of what you just said. So that's some of what we're doing. But I don't think it's right that it should just be you and me chatting. I mean, we're quite happy to chat until the cows come home. But I think it's important that we include others. So what do you think about that?
So totally agree, and I would also equally chat till the cows come home. And many people that kind of watch my Instagram stories know that I'm pretty guilty of doing that. So one of the things that you and I have got our heads together on is essentially looking into our respective little black books and saying what would be really useful to sort of tease out of these individuals that dedicate their lives to these certain things with regard to building conservation, that we can then interview and share with our audience. So we've got a number of interviews that are lined up, both with individuals in a very targeted manner that they've focused their lives on, but also those that are looking more holistically on the entire network and things. And I won't give a flavour of some of the people we've got lined up, but we've got, I think, 5 or 6 interviews lined up over the next couple of months. And the plan will be that either it's going to be done like this virtually, or maybe even go to locations to actually show round if they've got a particular interest. One of the things we do have, and I'm very fortunate that I've got a couple of friends that are in Oxfordshire, are just at the start of taking on a really fantastic renovation, I suppose it is. It is a renovation, conservation of an old vicarage. Lovely big old building, and they've been incredibly generous to allow Stephen and I to infrequently go and visit with the prime contractor, for example, when the whole roof comes off and goes back on again, and we can then use that as a bit of a sort of teaching aid, if you like, and interviewing the people that are physically doing the work on the building and talk through some of the things. And that's going to be great as a long-term project as this podcast goes on. So in terms of that's how we're going to do it with interviews, but there's lots of other things in the kind of more grand strategic that goes on in conservation, which Stephen, you've have had to wrestle with over the last decades in terms of whether it's particular case law or legislation and so forth. Just tell our audience how we're going to sort of tackle that as well.
Well, I think one of the things we need to do as part of the inform element of what we said earlier is to bring news updates, because occasionally things happen. I mean, for example, Historic England periodically bring out advisory notes. Now, a lot of our listeners will know about them, but some won't. And I think as and when things like that are published, we need to provide information about them and let our listeners know so they can go and hunt them down and read them or look up things. So news is an important element. And of course, in the present situation, we just had a change of government. And so we're expecting this new government to perhaps make new laws to change things. And so when that happens, I think we need to bring some updates as to how that may impact things. And of course, occasionally, and sadly, some things go to law, and that results in litigation. And I think it's important that we keep up to date with what's going on, because that could influence how things are done. Now, I'm fortunate in knowing a few barristers that specialise in this, and I'm contacting a few in the hope that we can persuade one or two of them to give us an occasional update as and when appropriate. We are keen to reach as many people as possible, and so we are keen for our listeners to mention this to other people and recommend it on if you think it's useful. So anyway, we'll say more about that at the end. But anyway, I think that's enough. I think we've provided a general overview of what we're going to be doing, some of the things we're going to be going through. But one of the other things we thought would be useful, but also entertaining, because we said we want to entertain, is to ask all of our guests when we interview them a couple of questions. So, Rich, the first of these is, what is your favourite building or place and why?
I had to think quite long and hard about this one, and I probably should have thought longer and harder about it, because for me, if I'm honest, it's probably the place I'm in now. It's probably my own home that I bought 7 or 8 years ago, and I think that's simply down to it was a fairly tired house when I bought it, and is now very much a home. And I've put a huge amount of blood, sweat, and tears into it, and I've now created something which is, for me, it's a personal legacy. It's a legacy of, this is my sort of stamp on this particular building. Haven't done anything to adjust its structure in terms of how it operates and how it works. I mean, being grade 2 listed, there is rightly restrictions on that, which I'm very much aligned with. But in terms of how I've made this into a family home for me, that's what's made this place particularly special. And it's a favourite of mine. It is my forever home. It is bigger than we needed, quite frankly, when we first bought it, but actually, of course, gradually grow into it. And there are still many, many parts of this house that I have not even touched yet, because just down to time and everything else. So this is probably my favourite place, and that's my reason why, which is perhaps particularly unimaginative, but I do love it here, and I do love working on it. And it's what's brought me to us together, I suppose, in terms of sharing that journey and what I've been on through social media and otherwise. So, Stephen, what is your favourite place? And give us a bit of a spiel in terms of why it is.
Well, as you can imagine, I've seen so many buildings over the years, but I come back to many years ago, I did an architectural study tour of Florence in Italy. And when I walked up to and went into the Duomo, which is the cathedral in the centre of Florence, I was just awestruck by the building, by its appearance, but also by the dome. I mean, Brunelleschi designed and built that dome. It was an engineering feat at the time. And it's only in recent years we've discovered how he actually did it. It's an incredible building, and I just am awestruck whenever I see it. But alongside that, closer to home, but very similar, St. Paul's Cathedral. Because again, Wren looked at Brunelleschi's dome when he designed St. Paul's with the dome on the St. Paul's. So St. Paul's and the Duomo in Florence are if you like, my two favourite buildings. But we also said, what about books? I don't know if you're a great reader of books as such. I must admit I am, but I'm rarely not got a book in my hand. And my wife won't let me go into a bookshop nowadays, and certainly secondhand books. She steers me well clear, because I invariably come out with yet another book. So, Rich, have you got any a book or a series of books that perhaps you would recommend in terms of if anyone wanted to further their knowledge in the world of conservation and what have you?
So I'm going to kind of buck the trend here a little bit. Not that this is the beginning of a trend, because we're going to ask all our guests this. But these are not necessarily conservation related, but they're actually two books, and I'm going to go grab them. Two books that I have found incredibly interesting and useful. And the first one is something that I don't know if I doubt it's certainly not still in print, but that's the Reader's Digest Complete Do-It-Yourself Manual. And for this, it's just absolutely fascinating. I'm very hands-on. I enjoy doing things. I like getting stuck in. I like having a go. Because in my mentality of things is, do your initial risk assessment. Am I going to risk life or limb, or am I doing something illegal? If I'm not, have a go, because what's the worst that can happen? You have to call in a professional anyway to fix it, and just have your tail between your legs, and he says, why did you try that? So for me, actually, something like this, which is it's essentially YouTube of old, isn't it? Where you've just got loads of illustrations of how to do lap joints and timber framing and bit of plumbing work and all those sort of things. Blooming brilliant. And actually, it's in a handy Bible and that's really useful. That's the first book. The second book is totally different, but it's a man that I've made friends with since on social media. And it's this book here, which is Greg Penn, Man with a Hammer. And this book tells the story of Greg, who started out by his own admission as being a bit of a DIY novice, I suppose, on his first house. He bought an old naval building, which was the admiral's quarters. Now, having lived in lots of military accommodation, let's just say that the maintenance of a military accommodation is not exactly what many would expect of accommodation, I suppose, and particularly poor state. This was in a pretty terrible state of all the various things that had happened over the decades before, and he's done an utterly incredible job of not just painstakingly doing all the work himself, but his taste in terms of decor, which is something I have no clue about whatsoever, is immaculate. Which is even more impressive considering, how he pairs all both the wallpaper and the materials and the furnishings and everything else and makes beautiful, stunning pictures because he's colorblind. And I think, how the heck does he do that? To be honest, which is amazing. So I am pushing this book because it's his first book, his book, which is all about the journey, and it's a really good read. So those are two things that I'm going to at the moment, which are just brilliant resources. And so, yeah, love them. Which are not necessarily about conservation, albeit that, let's face it, as you mentioned before, interiors are all part of conservation as well. It's all part of what is the heritage of the building that we want to try and conserve. So it all factors into that. So those are my two. But Stephen, do tell us what are your go-to resources that might be useful for our audience to hear.
Well, before I do that, firstly, I mean, the first one you showed, the manual, the DIY manual, I used to have that myself, and I'm not sure I've still got it. So I'm quite envious of the fact you've still got that. But I do have some old 1970s versions.
If I may say, this was actually in the second house I renovated. This was actually left behind.
Really?
so that was back in 2002, I think it was.
Yeah.
So actually, it's not something I bought, and I just thought, oh, that's quite interesting. I went, oh, I can now see all the things I did wrong on the first house, kind of thing, by flicking through it. So yeah, I inherited that.
Well, they're a great resource, and I've got a couple of old DIY manuals that I still occasionally return. In fact, my son-in-law was recently hanging some doors in his house, and in one of those old books, it told you how to do it in a way that I couldn't find elsewhere. So they're great. But anyway, what books do I find? Well, I think it's a series of books by one author. I've done a little bit of a video on this that's on YouTube anyway, and that's Brunskill. Ronald Brunskill, unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but he wrote a series of books in the 70s and 80s and 90s on different things. I mean, he wrote an illustrated guide to vernacular buildings. He's written timber building in Britain, brick building in Britain. He wrote a whole series of books, and they're fantastic reference books with loads of illustrations, both photographs and line drawings that he did himself. And they're a great resource. So I would suggest, if you can find them, because they're out of print, so you'd get them secondhand. But whenever I look online, I find them quite easily secondhand. But to anyone interested, I would say they're a fantastic resource, a series of books to go for. So that would be my go-to series.
I think the thing to do now, thank you very much for listening in terms of this third podcast. I hope you have got a bit of an insight in terms of who we are and why we are doing this podcast and what to expect from it over the future. Our aim is to make it so that we won't have a particular fixed period of when we put these podcasts out. We've got a number of interviews lined up, but of course it takes a huge amount of time to actually set them up, but also edit them and so forth. So we will get into a drumbeat in a routine, but don't want to set hairs running by sort of saying it will be every X, because that just puts the fear of God into Stephen and I, quite frankly. But we'll do them but we have got a number of these set up and in line for the future. It would hugely help us and support us if you subscribe to this, whether it's on the YouTube that's going to go out on or on wherever you get your podcast. That's incredibly helpful, because the other thing that is also useful to us is the engagement, the interaction. So actually, by contacting us to see what you would like to see in the future, and if there's any particular topics that you would like for us to cover, would be useful. What else, Stephen?
I think we should mention that whilst this is primarily a podcast, we are intending to do an associated YouTube channel. That our emphasis is going to be on this podcast, because we think that is the more important way of getting the information through. We find people find it easier to listen to something perhaps in the car when they're out doing their morning jogs and what have you. But we are going to be doing a YouTube as well, so watch out for that. That's for the future. It takes a bit more editing to do the video, and plus, unfortunately, you've then got to look at our lovely faces. But that is something planned for the future as well.
Brilliant. I think probably the easiest way to wrap up is saying, how do people get in touch with you and I, Stephen, I suppose, on some of the aspects we've covered on here or in other things we're doing? You go for it first, Stephen. What's the best way of getting in touch with you, do you think?
Well, I'd be quite happy if people want to just send me an email. Obviously, there's a facility with this podcast to put comments and questions in there if you want. On the YouTube, there'll be the same. If you want to ask questions or suggest topics, you can do that there. But I'm quite happy to give out my email address, which is Stephen, which is STEPHEN, and then it's at beconservation.com. So that's Stephen at beconservation.com. And if you want to send me an email, that's fine. If I find my email inbox getting flooded with questions, I might have to change the email. But for now, I'm quite happy for people to contact me that way. What about yourself, Rich?
So I think most of my audience currently, or most of the people that sort of listen to me drone on, have come through social media. So that's probably the easiest way to get in touch with me via a direct message on social media. It's the same handle that I use both on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, and in fact Facebook. And that is sympathetic_restoration. I won't try and spell it because I'll get it wrong, but hopefully most of you can spell it in the audience. But it's sympathetic_restoration, primarily on Instagram, but also, as I say, TikTok and YouTube as well.
At some point, Rich, you're going to have to tell me what TikTok is.
Yeah. It's where basically it's where I do the same as what I do on Instagram, but it's the medium of dance. Not really.
Okay, so that's great. Now, so we're in the process of recording of various interviews at the moment, so we can't say exactly what's going to be the next episode. So you'll have to look out for that. As Richard said, we're hoping to put these out maybe once a month or thereabouts. At the moment, this episode is about 45 minutes long, or once we've edited it down. We think we're going to keep them to between half an hour and an hour maximum. But we'll see, it depends. And if any of them are longer than that, we may have to split them up into 2 episodes if the interview is particularly interesting and lengthy. But let's see how it goes. This is a new venture for us, so bear with us. I'm sure we're going to make mistakes at the outset and
more mistakes.
But we just ask that you forgive us for those in advance and bear with us, because hopefully things can only get better, as they say in a song, I think.
I was going to say, cue music here. Fab. Thanks, folks. See you next time.
Thank you very much, and goodbye. You've been listening to Talking Conservation,
the podcast all about conservation of old, traditional and historic buildings and sites.
With me, Stephen Boniface.
And me, Rich Aylesbury.